Okay, everybody, if you can take your seats out, please, and we'll get started again. Okay, well, thanks very much for coming back. We'll crack on with the things as time is running a little bit short in some areas, but hopefully we'll make it up later. So next is the first of the scenario elements of the concept brief, and I'll hand over to Andrew Ward to go from there.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Ward. I'm from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority Australia. And the scenario that I have to present for you is related to an Australian operation. So as you'd realise, Australia is a rather large country, almost 8 million square kilometres and with a 36,000 kilometre coastline. So coastal surveillance, for whatever reason, be that for protecting the interests of the resources industry, fishing industries, or to prevent incursions, is something that is challenging for us. The Australian administered airspace is 1/11 of the Earth's surface. Our FIRs go halfway across the Indian Ocean and down to the South Pole. So the dark blue area that is very close to the coastline is Australia's territorial limit. Outside of that, the yellow limit is an exclusive economic zone. So aircraft that are operated over the land of Australia and out to that territorial limit, the operation is conducted entirely within one nation. Once you step over that 12 nautical mile limit, you're over the high seas. So the ICAO SARPs apply, and that's the reason that this scenario is important to this presentation. So presently, Australia's coastal surveillance is conducted by manned aircraft, and it's done by a contractor. So it's a civilian aircraft. It's not conducted by a state aircraft. The Air Force obviously has its own surveillance capability, but that's dedicated to military purpose. The surveillance capability for resources observation and for fisheries protection is done by a contractor. It's a large multinational aviation company that many of you would know, and they do that with Dash 8s that are configured to with special surveillance equipment and with extended range. And if the surveillance contractors pick up a target of interest, that target of interest is investigated by appropriate authorities, being that Air Force, Navy, or close to the coastline police. So in 2006, there was a trial done with Australian Coast Watch with a General Atomics Mariner, and thank you to General Atomics and Brandon Suarez for the permission to use the photos in this presentation. There's no certainty that the unmanned will take over from the manned in any sense in the future, but this scenario assumes that it would and looks at some of the issues if it did. The RPAS, the unmanned aircraft, if it did, may in fact be employed entirely as a military aircraft, or it may be a civilian aircraft. If it were a civilian aircraft, it would be the responsibility of my employer, the state regulator of Australia, and it would be operating under ICAO standards when it was over the high seas. So in order to bring this presentation down into a meaningful time frame, I've chosen to look at 6 different operational challenges. There are obviously many more challenges that would face an operator doing this sort of operation, but for the illustration of the fact that we've looked at appropriate standards and that the standards that we've are settling on would deal with the situation. We'll use these operational challenges to illustrate. So we've got the fact that it's a high seas operation, the airspace integration piece, the fact that it's a long endurance and vehicle and capable of 40-hour operations, the traffic separation, airport integration and operational diversion issues. But there are many other issues for an operator to grapple with. So, as a high seas operation, as I've outlined, it must follow all international norms. The ICAO standards all apply. So the two important articles of the convention that Filippo touched on are Article 8, which states that the contracting state of that aircraft undertakes to ensure that the aircraft flown without a pilot in regions that are open to civil aircraft must be controlled so as to obviate danger. And that's a clear principle on which we've been building the standards that we're now proposing. The second article that is obviously important is that all aircraft, and it doesn't state whether they were manned or unmanned, would be required to be registered and have a certificate of airworthiness issued. So that also is a principle in which we're operating. So that's a bit of an illustration of the FIR relationship in the area we're talking about. The part of Australia that this aircraft was trialled and the part that I've focused on is the northwest coast. It's an area that that has petroleum resources and gas resources, and it's also an area which is the way in which people who would want to come to my country by sea typically come. It's also an area which is close to other states, and the fisheries are sometimes poached upon. So it's an area that is interesting to Australia to keep an eye on. Okay, so airspace integration. The assumptions in which we operate, which we've building the standards upon, general assumption 2 is interesting in this regard because it talks about that the RPAS must meet the CNS requirements in the airspace in which it flies. And an illustration of how the proposal for Annex 6 Part 4 deals with that issue is we talk about that the operator shall not engage in IFR RPAS operations and unless that they have a certificate that is attesting compliance with the standards of this section. So that's a very, very broad statement and states that the operator, the aircraft and all of its equipment must meet those standards. So we've got potentially a 40-hour endurance aircraft that we're talking about here with a service ceiling of flight level 500. So that puts it in the range of airline traffic coming into and out of Australia. Normal operations about flight level 250. So that entirely covers the range of the IFR traffic that is there. So it would be in mixing it. It's not something down at low level. So with a 40-hour endurance, we're looking at multiple day missions, which means several busy periods in any one given airspace, because airspace, as many of you would realise, has a daily cycle where things are extremely busy according to the time of day that air traffic is aiming to get to its destination, and then it has points of the day when it's not as busy. Crew fatigue management obviously has a big issue with an endurance like that, but in some ways that's an easier thing to manage from an unmanned perspective because pilots are in their time zone, regardless of where the aircraft is, or potentially. But in any case, crew fatigue management standards match those for the manned community in the proposals for Annex 6. So we've got an illustration here of the traffic sort of patterns across Australia and the near Southeast Asia. Northwestern Australia is the entry and exit point for traffic going from the Gulf, from Southeast Asia and from Europe direct to Australia. It's also the point at which all traffic to New Zealand from those points comes across as well. So it's a reasonably dense part of the world. To give you a bit of context, Indonesian aviation as an industry became bigger than Australia about 3 years ago and will become bigger than the UK in about 2030. So that's our near neighbour is a very big aviation country already and becoming much bigger. So the traffic densities in that part of the world are quite high. An illustration of the ADS-B and radar coverages for that area, obviously not far out to sea, but you have to get to flight level 290 before you get coverage across the whole country there. At low level, the distances are just too vast to cover it at 10,000. If you threw that sort of picture across Europe or North America, I imagine you'd get coverage at a very low level. To talking about a lost link for traffic separation, operators have to ensure that their C2 link interruption procedures are appropriate for the operating environment, and the collision avoidance function of the aircraft must meet all the standards in Annex 10, even in the event of lost link. So when you're operating in airspace that requires the transponder, the RPA is required to also be switching to a beacon code to identify that the link has been lost. And regarding a communication with air traffic control, the capabilities are required to meet the RCP performance and that are specified for that airspace. This is all very similar to what is the case for a manned aircraft. And obviously the addition to that is if you have a requirement to relay through the aircraft, then there are additional requirements that would mitigate the failure of that. So detect and avoid is an issue which is peculiar to RPA, and the requirements there are for aircraft that operate remotely to have the ability to avoid conflicting traffic and all other hazards, regardless of the circumstances. RVSM, again, is an issue which is very similar to the manned requirement. For the areas for which RVSM apply and the separations required are that they are the same for RPAS, and they shall be provided with the equipment that meets those standards, so that the standards are completely reflective of what we're used to. Airport integration issues are obviously an important consideration. This part of Australia doesn't have that many airports. It's not a highly populated area. The population there is mainly congregated around areas associated with the resources industries, and the paucity of airports means that interoperation with manned traffic would almost certainly be required and would have to be planned upon even if it was from its own unique airport, because any diversion would be to an airport that had significant manned traffic and significant size traffic, that because of the paucity of airports there and the occasional high density of people for the resources industry, the typical traffic is 737, A320. I won't go through all of the requirements that operators would be required to meet for aircraft operating from public use airports, but they're significant and they're listed here, but I won't take you through every one. So, for airport integration, the the requirement for that the operator shall designate a pilot that has adequate knowledge of all airports that are used or may be used for alternates. Very familiar requirements to those of manned aircraft. Operational diversions might pose very interesting issues for the operators. I mean, diversions could be, in this scenario, applied for operational reasons because the aircraft is perhaps finds something of interest late in its operational sortie and then is required to divert somewhere else as a result of that. Alternatively, the diversion might be required as a result of an emergency. There may be a limited number of airports in this part of the world where such a large aircraft can operate to, and you have to question what are going to be the protocols for a diversion of an unmanned aircraft for an emergency purpose across an international FIR. That will be an interesting scenario. So, for flights on which it's intended to conduct an instrument approach and landing, and that capability must be available at any of the designated alternate aerodromes. Very much a manned requirement and something that is reflected here. And similarly for flight planning, for operational flight planning, the requirement of the operator to provide for the safe route of the aircraft, including for all alternative airports. And flight diversion obviously has to take account of the possibility of loss of the C2 link, and there would be requirements to provide for that across all classes of airspace that are likely to be encountered along the route. Something that is unique to the unmanned realm. Alternative aerodromes, also we've got requirements there for takeoff alternates, en route alternates and destination alternate aerodromes. Very much what you would expect for manned operation of a similar aircraft. So in summary, the proposed scenario is different to matters which are traditionally dealt with by ICAO. It's an aerial work function, being surveillance, not an air transport function, which ICAO is typically interested in. It's an A-to-A operation via international waters only, and because it's traditionally an operation that's conducted by a state rather than done by an aircraft which is operated by a civilian operator, it's not really considered by ICAO's freedoms of the air. However, in leveraging the legacy SARPs that we've had to work with, we've been able to provide a framework through Part 4 that proposes sufficient operational requirement while we believe making the operation viable. So, thanks very much for that. I'd be interested to take questions, or maybe some of my colleagues might be able to assist with some of the questions.
Okay. Any questions for Andrew from the floor? And I see Dominique waving in the back there, yeah? And your second. Dominique.
Good morning. Thank you. Good afternoon, sorry. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I have a question about the our RVSM operational capability. Do you consider when an aircraft is flying in RVSM airspace with 1,000 feet separation, when the RPAS is losing the link, it's also at the same time losing its operational capability because of lack of alerting and monitoring? So do you consider that it should exit RVSM airspace right away or not?
Want to take that, or shall I?
Oh, you can take it.
Yes, it's an interesting scenario. The aircraft is required to meet the standards, as I've stated. It will do what is required of it by its state of operator. And these are some of the things we're going to have to work through. is about as close to the answer as I can get.
And it looks like Dominique is happy with that, so that's good. Yes.
Yeah, Victor Robeck, IATA Flight Ops. I had a similar question related to the loss of the C2 link. Obviously, it also depends on the duration of it, but what are the SOPs when something like that occurs? Does it continue on altitude and heading, or does it climb? Does it try to land anywhere autonomously? What are the fallback procedures?
It's a very difficult question to answer for all of that breadth in one answer, but the question gets down to what the protocols that the aircraft has, and which are related to how it is certified to operate, in combination with the rules as we make them. There'll be circumstances where it will be appropriate for the aircraft to just land, but likewise there'll be en route hours from an airport, the aircraft will have to do the safest available thing. It has the ability to detect, it will be required to have the ability to detect and avoid other aircraft, and it will operate in accordance with the way it is set to go. But these are some things that we haven't grappled with at an operational level. These standards are providing the basis for that to be established.
Just to add a little bit to it, I'll come back to you in a minute, Edward. For us, it's primarily it needs to be predictable, but one of the other working groups within the panel, the ATM group, is working on these sort of procedures. So we're just dealing with the operational side, but we are relying on other groups to work on some details, like the detect and avoid group, like the C2 group and what have you. So that detailed will come from the ATM working group within the panel. Edward.
How do you provide surveillance of RPA by ATC and by remote pilot? If with the use of ADS-B 1090, how you validate data for both, for ATC and for remote pilot?
I think I might reflect the answer that Ron just gave, that these are issues that are really dealt with by other working groups. We're simply setting the base for the operation of the aircraft.
The scenarios that we present today at what are to show the increased, we slightly show the increased complexity of introducing an RPAS system to the aviation system at the moment. We're not delving into all those details. We're just showing this is the start. This is from our perspective, a fairly simple scenario. Not a lot of states are involved, not a lot of subcontractors are involved, and it will growly slow there. It's not that this is the perfect scenario or what have you. It's just an example scenario, and if somebody really wants to develop it, you probably need to be in touch with the operator in there. But that's all we can provide.
Simple scenario.
Yes, from our
No
operational
spoofing.
perspective.
No spoofing.
We don't even think about spoofing at the moment. No. Anybody else? Yep.
Did you take into consideration any thoughts about the amount of engines that need to be on an RPAS? Was this an issue in your discussions until now? Single engine, twin engine requirements, possibly.
No, it's if the configuration for us comes from other parts. We're just dealing, and just because of the fact that it's a 40-hour scenario, I think that's triggering your question. For us, that means you probably will not have one pilot piloting for 40 hours. I think that's very unlikely. But we haven't thought of a configuration that is doable with whether or not this is, I don't know. The scenario is from the Coast Guard from Australia, so they'll probably look into if this aircraft is fit for the purpose that they're flying with. Yes. But that's not our intention. We are just looking at, well, we're dealing with a flight that will last 40 hours, so we cannot have one pilot in command for 40 hours. We cannot have one remote pilot for 40 hours. That's the stuff that, so to start your thinking about, okay, that's the situation that we have to deal with. And so that's why you see, for instance, that we have consecutive remote pilot in commands in our systems to allow for this sort of operations. So we're not really validating the scenario itself. It's an example of the problems we run into compared to manned aviation.
I'll probably just add to that as well. Obviously, I think a lot of the operational scenarios will ultimately develop specific requirements for engines and configuration of aircraft and things like that as well. Please, again, remember, we're not offering a solution here in terms of this is the type of aircraft that will do things. Traditionally, at the moment, most of the larger unmanned aircraft are military ones, and they all tended to work with one single engine, you know, jet powered or turboprop or whatever. But that's just the way things have happened at the moment. That doesn't mean it'll be like that in the future. I would suspect for international IFR operations, for genuine operations, just like it's evolved for airliners into, it's obviously requiring multiple engines, but the number of engines have reduced in time with the airworthiness issues that they've allowed them to reduce. I think that'd be the same thing, but I might be showing my ignorance here, but I don't think there's anywhere within the ICAO ops requirements that says that the aircraft will have to have more than one engine. I might be wrong, but it's not, is there? No, I've got to check from that. So we don't set the requirements for that. It's the aircraft, and then it's the performance standards that need to do that. Clearly, if you've only got one engine, then what do you do when that engine fails, or if that engine fails? And that sort of establishes the requirements that come from there. So it's very much that will lead the development of unmanned aircraft or remotely piloted aircraft in the future as to how the shape and form of them. What we have at the moment is a legacy system which is generally sort of military based on what the military have been used, but don't think that we're here to just take what is a military aircraft and convert it into a civil aircraft straight away. It depends on the requirements. It depends on the operation. It could be some scenarios might need 4 engines max or whatever, but we don't really know. But the arena is completely open at the moment, and it really just depends on what people want to do and what manufacturers come up with. But these are the standards or the requirements that people have to fit into.
Any other question? Yes, all the way in the back.
Good afternoon. I'm interested to know from the Australian experience on how much workload does this bring to the controller. So it seems that various RPAS or RPA have quite different capability in terms of what they would do in the event of a loss of a C2 link, and different communications means, and different international flights coming from different directions. And so, you know, all the protocols and the scenarios that would occur in the event of an emergency or a lost aircraft or whatever, and depending on what the surveillance might be in that very airspace and which country the aircraft is crossing, well, you can't fit all this stuff on a flight plan. So I'm assuming that there's a formatted form that when there is a problem, the controller would be able to find out what the expectations are of the remote pilot and how that fits in with the air traffic stream for the air traffic controller. Can you take us through a wee bit of what practically it looks like for a controller?
Well, the Australian experience to date has been that some military unmanned aircraft have been operated from towered airports in control zones in very limited circumstances, but not an operation like this. And they have been not fully integrated, you would say, to date. We're talking about the future here, about a fully integrated operation, but that's a step above what has been achieved in my country so far, but other countries may have experience. large UAS of this scale have been operated in Australia from airports, including airports with airline traffic, but only in very, very isolated circumstances. But small drones are operated all the time, but they're totally segregated within the controlled airspace. So we're not at that place yet. Others may have other bits to offer there.
Yeah, I'll get another thing. In many ways, you've hit the nail exactly on the head as to the problems that we face, or we're all trying to face as a panel, as a whole, in trying to address these scenarios. Clearly, at the moment, the development of remotely piloted aircraft is at a relatively low level, civilian-wise, and a lot of the actual operations are just one-off operations or just sort of canned operations in an area, for which case, whilst you're doing the operation and you're doing a trial, you can actually let the controller know exactly what the planned loss comms procedure will be for that precise aircraft and for that scenario. Clearly, when you expand that into several operations, let's say 10, 20 years from now, where a reasonable percentage of the aircraft in the air will be remotely piloted, then we have to funnel ourselves down to more standardised approaches in terms of things like C2 loss and the initial reactions behind that, and then the subsequent action from there. You're dead right again about the flight plan. It won't all fit on Field 18, so there's other elements of that have been discussed. That I will slope my shoulders slightly and say that that's not the scope of the operations working group. There's an ATM working group is dealing with some of those things as well. But again, it's part of the bigger part of the RPAS panel. I mentioned at the start the RPAS panel consists of 7 working groups, of which ops group, the ops group that we're dealing with is just one part of it. So there's a much greater picture of things that all need to come together, and that will come together over time. But I'm afraid obviously everything focuses around the ops side of things, but yeah, there are other elements to think of as well. I'm an ex-air traffic controller, albeit a military one, so I've not got the specific sort of civil depth in terms of things. But yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from. The considerations are being thought of, but it's knowing the best way to go and what is most appropriate at the right time is still challenging.
I thought I saw another question here. Yeah. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, it might have been mentioned before, and it's not necessarily related to the operation in Australia, but any RPAS any civilian-operated RPAS should be detectable at any point in time. It was mentioned that some of them have ADS-B out. Was it a requirement that all RPAS are supposed to have ADS-B out, or what's the way forward on detection?
In this case, to meet the requirements of the airspace in which they operate. And being operated in an IFR airspace, they'll have to meet the requirements of that, which would imply ADS-B. Yeah,
so again, it's what fits into the airspace's future. If you put a manned aircraft in there, you put an unmanned aircraft in there, the capabilities and the surveillance sort of actions are essentially intended to be the same. Ultimately, the idea would be that it's probably slightly hopeful, but the idea would be that when a controller is operating an aircraft or surveying them, they don't know the difference between a manned and unmanned aircraft in terms of how they actually deal with it. The idea is the same. They see it the same way on the radar. It reacts in essentially the same way, or as close as we can. But the capabilities they have, it might be delivered, some elements might be delivered by different means. But essentially the idea is that it should be transparent to controllers and transparent to the aviation system as much as possible. There are subtle differences, of course, that the fact that you're controlled by, or the command and control link is a key element of that. We've got to consider the fact that if that is lost, that's slightly different from the requirements of the control column coming off in a manned aircraft or whatever. There are different avenues to that. So there are differences. Essentially, these are still aircraft. They're just piloted in a different way. And that's how we've tried to focus things, keep as much of the manned aviation as possible and become as sort of prescriptive and as performance-based as we can.
I might add that the requirement for ADS-B, of course, is not worldwide. In Australia, it's only required above flight level 180. It's expected, though, to integrate RPAS. It will be required in all IFR airspace, but that's a little way away because it requires fitment to a range of aircraft that weren't designed to accommodate it originally, manned aircraft, old manned aircraft.
Yes, Edward?
You told about mandatory ADS-B. In accordance with document 9924, ADS-B data for ATC should be validated by SSR or multilateration. Do you do that or not?
That is not the topic of the scenario or of parts 4 of Annex 6, Edward, and you know it. That's part of other parts of the panel work. So, and we're not focusing on per se how Australia is solving this. This is an example scenario which we use to explain what sorts and parts we have introduced in part 4 of Annex 6 from the operations perspective. Said this is not part of the discussion here, Edward, and you know it. It's been told yesterday. Catherine.
If I may, just a remark, because you said that, I mean, the requirements are exactly the same than from manned aircraft, perhaps just accept some requirements we could have for the detect and avoid. And ADS-B is one of those requirements, because ADS-B is not needed for all IFR aircraft. So it's just, perhaps it was clear for everybody, but just to clarify that point.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I see no further questions, so thank you, Andrew, and
Thank you.
I would like to get Hao on the stage to make things slightly more complicated, and we go to scenario 2.
Okay. Well, before you start, I think I have 3 functions for scenario 2. First, to get you for the application of part 4 Annex 6 in the scenario 2. Secondly, trigger the discussion. And the third function is definitely promote our work that is part 4 of Annex 6. Okay, for the scenario 2, we will talk about the transportation of cargoes between 2 small islands in the remote oceanic area. Okay, I have 5 parts. We start from the operational scenario, and the second part is the general requirement. The third part is special authorization and ROC. The fourth part is the operation requirement. We will start from the preparation to the landing. And the last part is the summary. Okay, the operation scenario. Since think about it, in the South China Sea, we have 2 small islands, remote area. They need to be connected with the mainland, and they also need, in some emergency situations, they also need the support from the mainland. So that is why the operator is thinking to provide the postal service to providing the medicine, the life raft, the food, beverage, and also some express post. But this area, even people are living on a remote small island, but this area is quite busy area because we have a lot of international airway. Look at this picture, you may find in this area, the international flight is quite busy, so the air traffic flow situation. Well, it is, the scenario is quite simple. They will take off from island A, which is within the FIR of Sanya. We land in the island B, which is within the FIR of Manila, but en route flight will across the other two FIRs, that is Ho Chi Minh area, FIR and Manila FIR. They also have alternative airports for the landing, because for the taking off, they don't need alternative airdrome because the only way for them is fly back to the original airport. This is a general picture, the general characters of the small unmanned aircraft system. I think the following information will be quite important. The aircraft, the maximum takeoff weight is 750 kilograms. The payload is 250. The ceiling or the altitude for the flight of the aircraft is 7,000 meters. But the cruise, or for this flight, the altitude of the flight is 3,000 meters. So the general requirement for the safe flight, which is quite simple for the RPA, they need to be type certificate, have a certificate of airworthiness to be registered in the state of operator. That is, in this case, it is simple, the state of the operator, state of the registry, and also one of the country will be flight over is one country, that is China. For the RPS, in this case, we have 2 RPS, one in the that is taking off airport, one in the landing airport. But the RPS could be independently to be certified or to be certified together with the RPA. For the command C2 and communication for the ATC. For the C2, it needs to meet the performance required link performance, or meet now we have the new terminology that is qualified of a service. In this case, since China Post is not a C2 service provider, they choose the contract C2 service provider. And this C2 service provider is under direct direct inspection of the CAAC, which is the Civil Aviation Authority of China. For the communication of the air traffic management, the ATC communication will meet the requirement of all the airspace of this flight from beginning to the end. We also have in the part 4 of Annex 6, we also have a requirement for the document for the journey log you may find in the section 1 of our document. Okay, for the ROC and special authorization. This is operator's information, which is a state-owned enterprise providing express service and other logistic service. Even it is a state-owned enterprise, the China Post need to go to the CAAC, which is Civil Aviation Authority of China, to apply the RPAS operator certificate. To get the certificate as a remote piloted aircraft system operator, they need to meet the requirement, the rules set by the state of the operator. We may have a requirement for the organization, safety management, and security. All these requirements should be settled, should be drafted, should be settled by the state operator. And the state operator is responsible for the safety operation of the operators. For the special authorization, in this case, the special authorization is not necessary because in the scenario we have mentioned, we have 2 small islands in the in the South China Sea, which means a flight will only take place in the airspace of the 2 small islands. For the other part, in the international IFR, they will not fly into the other 2 countries' territory airspace. So if the flight will not take place in the territory of the other countries, the special authorization is not necessary. It's not compulsory, but in this case, according to Article 8 of the Chicago Convention, the operator still need to coordinate with the other ACCs of the 2 FIR, that's the Ho Chi Minh FIR and the Manila FIR, because think about the international flight over the high sea for the safety of the international civil aviation. The operation of the unmanned aircraft should not endanger the international civil aviation. Okay, the coordination with the ATC needed to be put into the flight plan, and it needs to be coordinated in advance. And that is for the purpose of safety of international civil aviation. For the RPAS operation, we will explain phase by phase. The general requirement, that is, the operator has to follow first the law, regulation, and the rules of all the countries it may fly over, and also the rules set by the ICAO, because quite a big part of the flight is happening in the international IFR. Well, if the operator during their flight in the FIR of Ho Chi Minh, in the FIR of Manila, have some non-compliance activities, the state of the operation, not the state operator, so the Vietnam and the Philippines may notify the state of the operator. So that is notify, and the state of operator will enforce the regulation in the state of the operator. We also have some other rules for the operation, which is well drafted in the 3.1.3. As I had mentioned, I'm also promoting our work, so please read that part. For the flight preparation, we have several parts, but I will only point the several of them. For the preparation, all these requirements need to be met before the flight could start. So the RPA should be airworthiness and safe for this flight. Secondly, the instrument, equipment should be well installed and serviceable. For the RPS, are suitable, serviceable, and also paired with the remote piloted aircraft. For the C2-link, as we had mentioned before, the C2-link not only available, meet the required performance, and also be checked by the operator. The maintenance has been signed off, the mass and gravity well balanced, the ops limitation are well delivered by the operator and the flight crew. Flight plan. The flight plan will be filed to the ACC of the original airport, that is the airport within the Sanya FAR. But the flight plan will be transmitted to the other ACCs of the FIRs involved. So which means the flight plan will also be received by the ACCs in the Ho Chi Minh FIR and Manila FIR. For the diversion, because of a loss of the C2-link or emergency situation, all of this diversion should be coordinated in advance in the flight planning period. For the instrument, data, and equipment, since this case is happening on the in the sea, so this part shall be pay special attention. So not only the general requirement to the international flight, but also the CRPA shall be equipped with the sound signals to avoid the collision with some other probably ships in that region, and also one archer, one sea archer for the maneuvering if that is necessary. For the taking off, from the Sanya FIR, well, the operator is responsible to establish the pre-flight checklist. So the flight crew will follow the procedures well, as we have a long list from Andrew for the airport taxi maneuvering, try to avoid any collision with other manned or unmanned aircraft. Well, it is not compulsory for the airport to set the aerodrome operation minima, but if the airport has such operation minima, the operator should follow the rules set by the aerodrome operator. The departure, during the departure phase, the operator needed to follow the procedures of the Island A airport. Pay attention to all the special considerations and limitations which will written in the procedures of Island A airport. En route flight in the Sanya FIR, the separation service will be provided by the ACC of Sanya FIR. ACC will also providing the aeronautical information service. Well, here, since it is flying in the quite a busy area, well, the flight altitude is 3,000 meters. Even they have a separation service from the ATC, the operator needs to guarantee the DAA capability so that avoid any collision with not only the aircraft flying in the air, but also the terrain or some other obstacles. In the Ho Chi Minh FIR, quite a lot of things will happen. We will have two transfers. First, the transfer of ATC responsibility from the Sanya ACC to the Ho Chi Minh FIR ACCs. And we will have another handover, that is the handover from the remote pilot station of the original to the destination. For the safety and also for the reasonable allocation of the resources, these two handover or the transfer will not happen simultaneously. So we will let in this case, we will let the transfer of ATS responsibility happen first, and then the handover between the original RPS and the destination RPS. For the AIS, DAA, C2, and communication of ATC, the requirement is the same. In the Manila FIR, we will have another transfer, that is transfer of ATC responsibility. Well, the C2 service provider is the same according to the data we have had for the unmanned aircraft system. From the original to the destination, the distance is 700 kilometers. Their radio communication can only cover 300 kilometers, so they needed to use the satellite communication. Well, since the distance is just 700 kilometers, we will not change the satellite, and also we will not change the C2 service providers. So no switch between two satellites. During approach, we will have another round of transfer. That means transfer of ATC responsibility from the Manila ACC to the airport control tower. Well, even the flight is taking place on the island, during the approach period, the Annex 2, which means the rules of air, will also apply because that is flying over the high sea. Well, but in this period, since it is the remote piloted aircraft is closer to the destination RPS, the C2 service will switch from the satellite to the radio line of sight C2 service. Arrival and landing. This part will be the ATC service will be provided by the control tower. Well, this case, the airport is still controlled by the military, so we still need some, but open to the public. But we have to think about the coordination with the military. You have to also follow the limitations, special requirement of the military controllers. This aircraft is Alpha Bin remote piloted aircraft. If for the we have some special situation or the meteorological situation is not quite feasible for the landing on the ground, this aircraft could also choose to land on the water. If we have a diversion in the Manila FAR, the diversion should be coordinated as we had mentioned, coordinated with the Manila FAR in advance. Well, even in such diversion flight, the special authorization is not required. So from the beginning to the end in a normal flight or even in the diversion of the flight, in this case, the special authorization is not required. In the scenario we had mentioned, we have two islands for the alternative. We have two alternative aerodromes, but all these two aerodromes are controlled by just one country, that is the country of the state operator. So it is not necessary to get a special authorization because all the flights will not going into the territory of the other countries. For the emergency situation, which means they are not, this remote piloted aircraft could land on the water and the backup battery could support them for 20 hours. In the summary, I think in the South China Sea, in the remote island on the sea, for the benefit, for the living standard, or even for the prosperity of the island, I think for the safe, efficient, secure flight and take advantage of unmanned aircraft technology, the regional cooperation and the ATS also cooperation and coordination is very important to let this operation to happen. Well, the FIR is quite a good system because the FIR it is not necessary to connect with the territory airspace. So even in some parts of our planet, we still have some political or territory dispute. But with the FIR, with the coordination and the regional cooperation, that operation could still happen. Definitely, some parts of the island in the remote area, the airport, the tower, and also the ATS service is controlled, provided by the military. So the civil military coordination are also quite important for the enabling of such flight. For the flight or for the operation over the sea, it is not the Chicago Convention, the SARPs, but also the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea should be considered. But we should read the articles of both air law and the law of the sea in a positive way to enable the international flight, trying to avoid just because of some political or territorial barriers to make such benefits are accessible to the people live on the remote islands. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for how?
Just a question. With reference to all the phases of the flight, takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, and landing, is in any case the aircraft flight in non-segregated airspace, and is it always coordinated like a traditional aircraft and manned aircraft by the ATC, air traffic controller?
Yes, they need to, the separation will be provided by the ATC so that they will not have any conflict with the manned aviation or even some other unmanned aviation in the airport.
So is it in any case an IFR flight? IFR flight? Instrument flight, flight?
Yes.
Again, just a reminder that the scope is international IFR in controlled airspace. So that's what we're working to throughout.
Yes, if it is not the case, according to one slide of Filippo, that is out of scope of our panel.
Any other questions?
Yeah, but
Catherine.
perhaps are all the other traffic IFR, or could we have in the same airspace VFR flights and perhaps, non-cooperative flights?
I'll take that. Again, it depends on the class of airspace you're in, but we're talking about international operations, IFR in controlled airspace. So that's our aircraft is doing that. Depends on the class of controlled airspace, what the other aircraft are dealing with that. But that's we know that's the scope.
Yeah, but we have an issue as soon as you fly in Class E, because you could have non-cooperative aircraft. So you don't even know them. So how could you manage those flights with the RPAS?
Okay, I don't really want to get into discussions over classification of airspace and what's right and what's wrong. The classifications are what they are. The same goes for a manned aircraft today as compared to an unmanned aircraft. It's all the same. Remember, as again, you're head of the detect and avoid group. We are creating, and there is going to be a requirement for the aircraft to be equipped with detect and avoid capability as well. So I think I don't really know what else I can answer from that, but it's the scope is the same as any other manned aircraft flying in that same airspace.
Okay, Gary, probably I will try to answer the question from Catherine. In the airport, even we have a VFR first, as we had mentioned, the unmanned aircraft operator has to follow the instructions from the ATC. Secondly, especially for the taking off, for the VFR situation, we also have the observers. So the observer and the pilot need to keep N8 direct eye contact with RPA. So keep the clearance from the other, even that is non-cooperative aircraft or vehicles. For the flight in the air, I would like to reconfirm what I have heard from Gary, that the DAA capability for the unmanned aircraft is very, very important for the international flight. Otherwise, that is quite, that is the second paragraph of Article 8, they are endangering the international civil aviation.
Thank you. One question from my side would be, why do you need 2 RPS on this scenario? I didn't get the point on that. Thank you.
Could you repeat your question? Thank you.
Why do you need 2 pilot stations for this scenario? Why do you need one here and one there?
Okay, that is because of the range of the communication of the RPS, and also for the safe operation. If they have 2, even now they are using, you're quite right, because they have a satellite communication. 1 RPS could cover the whole area, but have 2 to get ready for some emergency situation, or 1 RPS is not working properly, they still have the backup.
And to add to that, it's an example scenario. So it's maybe not, we didn't do the math if this is the most efficient way, but we wanted to introduce a second RPS there to start to complicate things a little bit for you. And don't worry, it's going to be a bit more complicated soon. Anybody
Well, anyway,
else?
this is the case we created.
Anybody else with any questions before we go to scenario 3? Okay, sorry. Yep, go ahead.
Yes, please. You mentioned that in case of adverse weather, the airplane can land on the water. Will the Annexes Part 4 will develop EFR procedure to land on the water?
Well, I'm not quite clear about the question. Would you explain again? Thank you.
Yes, because you mentioned during the presentation that in case of adverse weather conditions, the aircraft will be capable to land on the water. So my question is that if the Annexes Part 4 will develop operations to land by instrument on the water?
Okay, according to my understanding, yes, but I think this will be the right person to answer this question will be our rapporteurs.
Yeah, thanks. No, I don't think it will. Again, maybe it's stretching the example a little bit to bring in something else as well, but we're not intending to get overly concentrated on flying boats and seaplanes and things like that, other than the basic scenario. So the simple answer is no. We'll do no more than what's in for flying or sea aircraft, flying boats and seaplanes already in the other annex and the other parts of Annex 6. So we'll just leave it at that. We will concentrate essentially on land planes and traditional operations. Maybe in a few years, if suddenly everybody decides that every RPA is an amphibian aircraft, then we might have to consider it a little bit more.
Okay, then I propose we continue with scenario 3. Thomas?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Hao. And I think scenario 3 and 4, we know you will learn soon, are fairly closely related, so we'll have John up here as well. So we can have a smooth handover, and we suggest to have questions after the presentation of both scenarios. Thank you. And good luck, gentlemen.
So good afternoon. My name is Thomas Mildenberger. I'm the RPAS panel member for IFALPA, the International Federation of Airline Pilot Associations. And naturally, I will introduce to you a scenario, an air transport scenario, probably the most easy one for you to understand, because you will see I got the easiest part of the presentations today. First of all, my predecessors introduced to you all the complicated nitty-gritties, so I don't need to concentrate on that. And the operation I'm introducing is basically the one you are most used to here in ICAO. So the scenario basically concentrates on an international cargo flight originating in Athens, crossing the European network, and then crossing the Atlantic Ocean, international waters, arriving basically in US national airspace for a landing in New York. That is a scenario. Here is the FIRs, which will be crossed. First of all, we start in Athens, FIR. We continue via Albania, then to Italy, from Italy to Switzerland, from Switzerland to France, and then via UK and the North Atlantic track system over to the American continent and there in the NUTS airspace. So we divided the flight in 7 flight phases, from flight planning to RPAS preparation, and then via takeoff, the cruise, including a contingency scenario, to an approach and a landing and post-flight. However, the first and the last bit is not interesting for the example, so I leave it out. I start with the preparation because there is a difference to manned aviation. We basically start the flight with establishing the link between the RPS and the RPA. And that is something very important for the pilots because in manned aviation we are paid to block hours, and that is now the new time defined for our salary. Then you see the next phase is basically the takeoff, and the other phases follow consequently. So we made some assumptions. We performed the flight with a certified cargo aeroplane, remotely piloted aeroplane, certified according to Annex 8. We have radio line of sight, command and control link for the phases takeoff, departure, arrival, and landing for performance reasons. So you learned already the abbreviation Remote Pilot License, RPL. I introduce the abbreviation RLP, Required Link Performance, although we are in a discussion to change that expressions. And the C2 link for the cruise phase is basically beyond radio line of sight. That is the satellite service already mentioned by my predecessors. The complete flight is managed by one RPS. So far to the question, why do you use 2 RPSs? Located in Greece. And obviously all the problems, including the problems you raised as questions from the floor, are solved. So we have solutions to detect non-cooperative targets. We have all the solutions in place. That is basically assumption for this operational scenario. So what do we have? We have an operator who owns the station and the aircraft, located in Greece. Obviously, he has a remote operator certificate issued by the competent authority in Greece. He manages the radio line of sight C2 link for departure and, as you see later on, also for the arrival in the US. The state of registry is state A, and the exclusive oversight for the flight during the flight in the Greek airspace is obviously also by the competent authority of Greece. And for the other flight phases, according to established ICAO procedures. So shared responsibilities, state of the operator, overflown state, and in case of the landing in the US, it's obviously a shared responsibility with state B, which is in this example the US, and the state of the operator. As regards the diversion example you saw in the slides before, here this little cloud, there is some discussion ongoing how we deal with this, because obviously if we assume that we need a higher performance of the C2 link in terminal areas than in the cruise portion of the flight, then what do we do if we do not have provisions for this higher link performance in case we have to do a diversion landing in a third country, basically. So that is some issue we probably will need to address in the future. So what do we have? We have country A responsible for departure. We have country A and B for the destination. We have country A and C for the overflight part and probably for the diversion part. And we have country A responsible if you cross the international waters. What does it basically mean? It is the same thing than in manned aviation. That's the reason why I said I have the most simple example, basically. We have one difference to manned aviation, and that is the beyond radio line of sight part. As Filippo already explained, the provisions we foresee is that we have a service level agreement between the operator and the C2 link service provider, overseen by different issues. You already remember that slide. I concentrate only on this part because, as I said in the assumptions, the whole operation, the whole flight is in the hand of operator A and is overseen by the competent authority of operator A, of Greece in that example. And we have provisions in the text which basically deal with the relationship between this operator and the C2 link service provider. You might read the paragraphs in detail in our draft. What I want to highlight is we foresaw basically those two options Filippo already raised. Either the C2 level service provider has its own competent authority or he goes into the safety management system of the operator. As I said, it's the most simple scenario. It's basically copying how we do international cargo operation in manned aviation right now, with the exception of the beyond radio line of sight C2 part, which is very crucial, I'd like to add, because the C2 link is not just communication. It is basically the physical link between the pilot and his aircraft. So it has much more criticality than just communication. And insofar, we are really looking into this issue because we know the principle of service level agreements, but I'm not aware that we have service level agreements right now which have such a criticality for the safe operation of a flight. So that was the most simple scenario. We can complicate it a little bit further. We have, in the sub-scenario 1, we have an RPS located also at the destination, probably because of the necessary performance. We could complicate it further, but that is not part of my presentation, basically. So I'd like to hand over to John, the regulator, who can give you the complicated scenarios and the complicated insight in the scenarios.
Good job. Good afternoon. I'm John Swigart, and as Thomas mentioned, I am a regulator. I am an aviation safety inspector. Most of my work with the FAA has been producing policy and guidance and helping to develop that policy and guidance for performance-based navigation operations and operational approvals and things like that. So if you hear me say those terms, keep in mind that these flights, and I'll buy all these examples today, when you have an ROC, that they will fall under the purview of the local CAA and the operation specifications for the areas of operations, special areas of operations, and all that will be worked out in greater detail later as we produce our RPAS manual. We incorporate RPAS into the PBN documents, Doc 9613, and all kinds of other things that need to be developed as a result of these, the basic groundwork being laid in Annex 6, Part 4. We got rulemaking, orders, guidance, operation specifications, and all that operational criteria and guidance will be developed as the technology becomes more mature. Yeah, they added them in there. So, this example, it is complicated, and I'll just explain a little bit more about that. It's not gonna take a great amount of time to explain it because I have a picture that's worth 1,000 words. So the flight it's the same as Thomas presented, a flight from Athens, Greece to New York City. It's scenario 4, and with various levels of interaction between, think about it, the ROC operator and basically all third-party providers, third-party service level providers, the C2 link, the RPS station, and quite possibly the RPA itself, depending on what kind of an agreement that the operator has with the ownership of the aircraft. So, and a lot of this is still in place today, or it's in place today with wet leasing, like Filippo mentioned, and service level agreements in areas and between nation states and things like that. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that this can't be done. However, it does become quite complex. So the main principles for this scenario for international legacy SARPs are applied, and the newly developed RPAS operations in Annex 6, Part 4 will apply. The flight is conducted with all elements of the flight under the ROC's sole reliance, so the certificate holder sole reliance on operation by third-party service providers and contract pilots. So this slide right here, I stole this from Filippo's presentation because it's pretty good. It kind of paints the picture of, and you can kind of view it as what the flight actually looks like, as far as the magnitude of a lot of moving pieces and parts, in my opinion. So the flight starts in Athens. There's an overflight over the high seas, and it ends up in New York. So it departs out of Athens. That's pretty straightforward. State of the operator. That's the first RPS station's in control, and the pilots are in control. Those are contract pilots. It's going to be a contract station. Everything about this is all third party. So you see as the flight progresses, there's a potential. I mean, is this realistic? You have this many stations. I don't have a clue. But I mean, if you really think about it, for this scenario, in my opinion, would be a large transport category aircraft and a much longer range flight for the utility. I mean, and I'm talking very, very long endurance flights, where this scenario could possibly take place. So if you really look at it, everything it's all contract, service level providers, things like that. For me, the regulator, to regulate and make sure that the safety, the operational continuity, reliability, and integrity are in place as it is today with manned aviation, that we have a regulatory thread between all those operations and all those stations and all those pilots. And by that I mean that as it is today for an AOC, they have operation specifications and they have operational approvals and things like that. And Thomas's, the example that he put up there for flight over the high seas, that's high level airspace out there. There are navigation performance requirements out there. It's a special area of authorization. You talk about diversion. We require, and I think this is a requirement for other states, that you at least go through a tabletop exercise, and in most cases a flight. And you basically throw all the scenarios at the operator to make sure that if there is a diversion, if there is a loss of an engine, that they fly to and they go to the alternate, and everything is done as it is today with manned aviation. Because I mean, there's no way for us to ensure, as a regulators, that the operator is prepared for all these scenarios. So we provide the guidance, and we provide all the rules, and we show operators the way. And in this case, each one of the pilots will have to be trained under those special operation specifications attached to the ROC. And they will have to have, direct knowledge of that. And the ROC will have to have some type of a direct agreement with the station itself and those contract pilots to ensure that they are properly trained. They're maintaining currency, type rating if it's required. Maybe it requires the use of a two-pilot crew for certain phases of the flight, and all things that are to be determined. So, with that said, I mean, you can, if you really think about it, you look at some of the complexities that really that challenge the regulators when we start to apply the SARPs and we convert those into our rules, and we make sure that, when we approve an operator to fly over your airspace, that, that they're as safe as the airspace, or as safe as the operator that you're sending back to possibly, country A, country B, just, pick any kind of countries out there in the world out there, and that's the way we do business today. So the same methodology will apply, but nonetheless, there is a way to get it done. Some states out there don't have the wherewithal to put up all the infrastructure in place. They don't have the wherewithal to manage an ROC, and there is a way for them to sign agreements, and people can thrive out there as an industry and be safe at the same time. So that's about all I got. It's just something for you to think about. Just keep in mind, this is like we've kind of repeated up here. It's notional, and I mean, there is a way for operators worldwide to do this, and you probably the most likely scenario is you're going to have combinations of service level providers, maybe possibly contract pilots. It becomes easier if you have your own pilots and your own operation, and you have direct oversight over their training and things like that we have over flight crews today. So, any questions?
Okay, thanks. Over to the floor again. I think one thing possibly add that as this scenario has grown and grown, you might want to consider the options of sort of pilot or crew limitations and circadian rhythms and things like that. That there's essentially, ultimately, there's a possibility that people could remote pilots in one pilot station somewhere could be flying between 9 o'clock, for example, to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. When it comes to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they hand that control of that aircraft, or perhaps a number of other aircraft, over to another part of the world where it's 9 o'clock in the morning there, and then they carry on the flight from there. So that could be a new way of doing things to potentially beat some of the fatigue problems of operating aircraft in the middle of the night or very early in the morning. I'm not saying that is a way, but that's another possible scenario of the way the transfer or the handover of control to other pilot stations might be required, or might be seen to be benefit from there. But anyway, are there any questions at all? You've all gone very quiet. It's stunned you. I've probably done it for the rest of the day. No, it looks like it, I think, yeah. Okay. Last chance? No? Good.
You guys are the best. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks Thomas and John for these last two scenarios. I think it's time for us to wrap up now, and I have 45 minutes for the wrap-up according to the agenda, so I can be very lengthy and extremely boring, or I can release you a bit early. And those who know me probably know I will choose the second option. Well, thanks for attending. I understand this is a fairly new experiment for ICAO. We will hear from them how they liked it, and I will tell them how I liked it. I hope it has been useful for you to see through the first through the high-level introduction, and subsequently through hopefully realistic as possible scenarios, what sort of issues we are facing within the RPAS panel, and more specifically from our ops perspective, when we compare it to manned aviation. That's why we focused on introducing the items that are not known from manned aviation, because the things we know from manned aviation we will leave the same, but in other cases we will have to adapt, and we have found solutions for it, and we will present those solutions in a bit more concrete way tomorrow afternoon. The scenarios were just sort of setting the scene, giving you an idea of the problems you're facing, and one of the questions a bit earlier on was sort of addressing quite a few of the questions we have been addressing the last couple of years. So I hope this helps you in understanding what's the difference between the manned and the unmanned world. I hope to see you all again tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. We will start here in this same room, and then you get the boring stuff, because we will actually look into Annex 6 Part 4. But don't worry, you will not see the draft text on the screen. We will try to help you, guide you in reading it and finding the places within the SARPs where you specifically see the issues that we have flagged today from the operational perspective, where you can find them addressed in the SARPs in Annex 6 Part 4. So hopefully it will help you in reading the document a bit more clearer, having a better understanding of what the issues were that we're trying to address, and that will help you in providing us in comments on the documents once we request them from you, so we can improve our documents even further from your experience. With that, I would like to thank all the presenters for this afternoon, Mark for assisting us, and I would certainly like to thank you all for sitting here, staying awake and paying attention. Thank you very much.